Hey guys, and welcome to the first text for our particular unit, which is the good life. The first thing we need to do is understand we are going to read the Gorgias. And when we read the Gorgias, or Gorgias, I shouldn't say the Gorgias, we are reading again another one of Plato's dialogues where Socrates is the main character and there are three other philosophers who like to have a bit of a discussion with him. One of those is Gorgias, and Gorgias has a bit of a discussion with him at the start, but he's not really the main focus of the whole dialogue. That ends up being a discussion with him and Callicles later on. However, because Gorgias is the host of the party, the book is called Gorgias. Okay, so what are we going to try and achieve as we watch this summary video? Well, we're going to build a basic understanding of the arguments presented in this section. So I'm going to provide a summary of just what is written in the dialogue between 480A and 484C. So that way you can perform a more in-depth or thorough reading of it. We have to read the text that's mandated by the curriculum of this section afterwards. So we go through it word by word and do a bit of an analysis. So the success criteria are pretty familiar to you. We need to name and define key terms, as we always do. Then we need to interrelate these key terms, put them together and form premises, and these premises help us form arguments once we make conclusions from the premises. And then we go ahead and we look at which of the main speakers are making what arguments, or which arguments. I don't know. I think I got the grammar wrong there. Then we need to compare and contrast the philosophical positions of Socrates and Callicles. Even though Paulus is mentioned in this section, really it's Socrates and Callicles who have the biggest clash, and they probably have the most well-developed arguments. So that's what we're going to do. I'd like you to pause and score yourself. Remember, if you think you can do all of these really well, I'd like you to give yourself a 4 for each of these. But if you don't think you can do them at all, give yourself a 1. All right, and then after that, can you draw an APK which represents how you would live a good life from your own personal point of view? Because I'd like to see how we can use that picture in the long run to think about whether or not you would side with Callicles or Socrates. All right, cheers. So just a heads up, we are trying our best to make sure that we align ourselves with the textbook. The reason for that is because we want to give you a couple of access points. Some of you prefer reading textbooks. It's just a good way for you to quickly get hold of the content and construct your notes, and others prefer to watch the videos and the interactive summaries. What I'm going to do too is I'm going to provide a summary of a section as provided in the textbook, and then we'll move on to doing a thorough reading of just that section, and then it'll just keep going until we finish what we're expected to finish according to the VCAR study design. All right, so let's get started. Now the text, the one thing I really like about having a textbook is because it gives me an inroad that I would never have thought of, and I would never have really thought of myself. I never really would have thought of defining these key terms here, which is the physis and the nomos. But quite rightly, the textbook does get us to do that, so we can form a bit of a historical context and understand the real debate that's going on here. Because when Callicles and Socrates are having a bit of a discussion, as we'll see, what they're really assuming is that you already have a knowledge of this concept of the physis and the nomos, okay? So let's begin. The two key terms that we really need to get an understanding of are right here. The first thing is the physis, which is basically this argument that any social norms or moral norms that we may have, they could be prescribed to us by nature. We look at nature, we look at how nature works, and we think about our human nature, and we think about the core of just natural principles. We could argue, some philosophers did, that it was just basically the way that we conducted ourselves and what we thought was ethical and moral was based on the way we reflected on how nature works, and the rules of nature prescribe to us these social moral norms. And if we believe that, then we kind of subscribe to a theory that believed in the physis. And if you can see that that has a kind of very similar form to the word physical, which then, you know, is synonymous with the concept of natural, then you can kind of see the relationships between that. So I'm going to request that you quickly take a note about what physis is and ask me a question if you didn't fully understand what it was that I was saying. All right, so that's what we've got there. The other, and I'd say we antithetical, the opposite way of looking at social norms and how are they constructed, is by referring to what we call the nomos. And this is one that the sophists really did believe in. And their argument was that really moral and social norms are nothing but constructs of society and social convention. We all come together, we all have a discussion, we all socially construct what we believe to be social and moral norms. It's the complete opposite of the physicists, because basically here we assume that we find them in something natural and external to us, but in here we're saying they're kind of created by society, they're created by us. It's not external to us as a species. So if you could take a note, that would be fantastic. So what's going on now then is we're looking at assumed knowledge that you're supposed to have to understand really what it is that Callicles and Socrates are talking about. Now remember, Plato's hero is always going to be Socrates. We knew that from reading Phaedo. But, and again, I guess in this text, he dukes it out with three philosophers. And what we really need to understand here is that these two guys are really duking it out in the text from two very opposing points of view. So that's why I've got verses right in the middle. Now, here we've got something which is, well, it's kind of trying to see how the debate is being framed between the two, okay? And they ask this question. They say, what is more contemptible according to whatever contempt is? So it could be something socially constructed, or we could say contempt is generated because we violate the natural laws that help us generate these social norms, right? So what is more contemptible? Is it that we do wrong or that we suffer wrong? What should be worse? To be a person who suffers wrong or someone who is actually doing wrong to others? Now you need to note that down, because that is a very key question that frames most of what Gorgias is about, okay? So I'd like you to write that down. Now, the text itself is not questioning whether or not there are some parts of human nature prescribed by nature, okay? Both philosophers assume that the natural world in some way affects us and who we are, plays a role. But it asks the question, more importantly, that moral prescriptions of what is right and wrong, they may come from either social conventions or they may come from either natural conventions or places outside of society where human nature or the rules of nature govern what is right or wrong. Okay? So let me just recapitulate, because I'd like to go through what the debate is mainly framed around. It's basically, the text isn't really questioning whether or not nature does influence us and prescribe us some rules or some norms about human nature. Its main question is more about these moral prescriptions, and are they products of the natural environment or the physis, or are they merely things that are circumscribed or created through social constructs or created through society? So take a note. All right, let's start reading the text. So the text, when we come into the section that we're supposed to be in, which is 44a, now remember how the dialogue will be set out. You'll have a look. Obviously, it's got numbers corresponding to different parts of the text, and then those numbers are broken up into A, B, C, D. Well, we're coming in at the end of a discussion between the second philosopher in the text, which is Polus, and Socrates. And they both agree that it is more contemptible to do harm, because that is what in turn places bad consequences for the person that has actually done harm. All right. So from the individual's point of view, they both agree that causing harm to others or doing wrong puts in place a set of chain and cause and effect relationships that will end up creating harm and doing damage to you. All right. So then Polus asks a quite natural question. Yes, we both agree that it's more contemptible to do wrong than it is to suffer wrong. But what if you've done wrong? How do you fix yourself? How do you stop these horrible things in the future from actually happening to you? And Socrates' main argument is you punish yourself. And that's what this guy's doing. It's an old form of self-punishment called self-flagellation. And what he's doing is he's got some chains and he's whipping his back, the back of his shirt. And he says you have to do this because in a way it kind of purifies you. You, as a person, yourself, your soul will be sick unless you punish yourself and purify yourself and make yourself turn from a sick soul or a sick person to a person who is well. Okay? And he says if you would engage in rhetoric, which remember is the art of persuasion, not necessarily the art of philosophy, you wouldn't be able to get better because you'd be doing it under practices that are lies and deceit. They're completely wrong. So he actually says that the use of rhetoric does you some harm, but it also harms your family and the people that you love and care about. So you wouldn't do it because basically it causes harm to you, it causes harm to the type of person you are, the soul, the self, whichever thing is brought up or whichever thing you think you are. So then they ask another question. What if you do something wrong to someone else? So what if you're not just doing wrong, but what if you are doing something wrong to someone else? And he says again, well, it's actually a bit of a horrible thing because it means that the other person is pretty much going to avoid punishment and he's going to stay sick. He's going to be spiritually sick. So, that's not necessarily a good thing. Right now, before we get into Callicles, I'd like you to just take some notes. Remember, and I'll just recapture, recapitulate, no, not recapitulate, just recapture what I've said. They come in the end of a discussion, they both agree that the worst thing is to do harm to others rather than to suffer harm because it pretty much harms you, the self, the soul, whatever you think the you is, and puts bad consequences in place. Then he says, what if you actually have done wrong? What do you do to fix yourself? Okay, well, to prevent these bad things from happening. Well, you punish yourself, and you do that to convert yourself from a sick person into a well person. Take a note. That's pretty important. Okay, and the thing is that if you were to use rhetoric to kind of improve yourself, you'd be doing it through a system, a way of thinking that isn't actually based on truth. It's based on deception. So that wouldn't make you get better. In fact, what you'd be doing is causing harm to you, your family, and people that you care about. Okay? Take a note. So then the question is not necessarily whether or not you do something wrong, but what if you do something wrong to someone else? Well, if you were the victim of that act, or if someone you knew and cared for was the victim of that act, you would want to see them punished. But also he believes that the person who did the act would be able to avoid punishment if they used rhetoric, because they wouldn't be trying to improve themselves, improve their souls. Or I don't know at this point what Socrates is arguing is the self, so maybe I should just use the terminology the self, okay? So you can't purify yourself, you can't make yourself better, and that person will never be able to make themselves better, which is actually worse for them. All right, take a note. At this point, Callicles is listening in. And Callicles is he has a very antithetical position to Socrates. He kind of disagrees. And according to Callicles, he starts questioning all these claims. He says, look, I don't know if I agree with you, Socrates. This really isn't the way I see it. I tend to disagree. And Socrates says to him, well, you know what? You're only saying this because you are parroting the ideas of the masses. And the ideas of the masses, they're wrong. In fact, I am right because I practice philosophy, right? That's why I've got the philosophers here. My ideas might be different from the rest of you guys, but at the end of the day, I'm not parroting the masses. I'm using truth and philosophy to arrive at what I think is correct. Okay? Take a note about that. And now we see why Callicles is quite clever, because Callicles is not as philosophically or intellectually weak as Polus or Gorgias. Okay? So he actually says, hey, Socrates, no, I think you're wrong. I think you're the guy who's got this wrong. He basically says, did you realize, Socrates, that when we try and pursue this idea of truth, we're effectively steering ourselves towards an ethical ideal. Something that is true is essentially something that is good. And something that is good is based on a set of ethical conventions, right? And these conventions are generated by society. They're part of they're done through the nomos, okay? Society gets together and society generates these conventions. In fact, right, yeah, so they design the conventions about what is ethical and what is right. And in a sense, it's, look, I disagree with Polis when he says that um, the worst thing that you can do is to cause harm. In fact, he kind of says it's better to cause harm. Now, he doesn't necessarily agree with it, or it's better to do harm to others than to suffer harm. So he says, look, I disagree with this. But the only reason why we think it's right is because this is a rule, or this is a social convention, or it's a piece of ethics that was generated and created by the masses. And the masses are weak and afraid. And they try to protect themselves using this social convention. They try to protect themselves from the strong. And really, if you look at nature, nature doesn't protect the weak. Nature allows the strong to have it all, to have more. And he ends this section with a little comment where he says, if a man is born in whom nature is strong enough, he'll shake off these limitations and win his freedom. And I'm pretty sure that when he's referring to limitations, he means these social conventions generated by the masses who are weak. And he'll win his freedom, and then the natural law, in this case the law of, which can be analogous to a predator versus its prey, will blaze forth, and the strong will take what they rightfully deserve according to the laws of nature. So let me just go through some key points, right? And I'll stop, give you a chance to take notes, okay? In this section, Callicles starts questioning Socrates, and Socrates says, well, you're just parroting what the masses say. Socrates then says, look, I'm actually correct here. I know my opinions aren't necessarily popular, but they're based on the pursuit of truth, not rhetoric. And because of that, even though they're not popular and they're very original, they are true. Take a note. To which Callicles, who's quite smart, says, look, I disagree with you, Socrates. Actually, I believe your belief system is a product of the masses, not mine. Okay. Take a comment. You should probably write that down. And then he goes on to say, did you realize when you talk about truth, which you think philosophy is based on, you're really steering yourselves towards an ethical idea, an idea of purity, about goodness. Truth is about the good, about, aspiring to achieve something. And this good is, because it's primarily an ethical ideal, it's a moral ideal, generated socially, it's constructed socially. Again, it's he believes that ethical concepts are constructed in a way that involves the nomos. Okay, take a note. He then goes on to argue that Polus was wrong to say that it's better to suffer suffer harm than to cause harm. Well, it's better to suffer wrong than to do wrong, which is probably better language. And he says that this is only something that we believe is right, or that you, Socrates, believe right, is because it's a product of the masses. And the masses really are weak. Only a few people are strong. They're weak and afraid. And they put in place social conventions that protect themselves against the strong. And that example, I guess, would be it's better to suffer wrong than it is to do wrong, because it's a way of protecting yourself against the strong. And it's generated by social convention. They're the kind of comments that need to be noted down right now, okay? He then goes on to reference nature. And he says in the natural world, the strong take what they want. It's natural for the strong to have more. and in the case here we've got a lion eating its prey. I mean, the lion is the strongest, and therefore it gets the lion's share of what it deserves. That's the way the laws of nature work. And again, Callicles ends this comment by saying that if a man is born in whom nature is strong enough, he will shake off these limitations. I should get rid of that full stop. And win his freedom. Then natural law will blaze forth. So, what I'd like you to do now is to draw up a bit of a comparison table, and I would like you to just do a bit of a comparison between what Socrates is arguing about doing wrong and what Callicles is arguing about doing wrong. Then, obviously, go to your textbook, refer to page, I'm just finding it right now, refer to page, where are we? Yep, I'd like you to go to page 197, and can you answer the right and think questions? That will really get you thinking about the issues that have been brought up in this summary. Okay? Cheers. And then when you've done that, can you go back and score yourself on the success criteria? And I'd like to know if you feel like you can tell me what some of the key terms are. You can look at the interrelationship between different premises and how arguments are formed. Obviously, most of you would know that Socrates would argue that it's better to suffer wrong than to do wrong, whereas Callicles would argue it's better to do wrong than to suffer wrong. And you probably would have more of an understanding of Callicles' position than you would Socrates' position at this point in time. Cheers, thank you.